All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's live stream. We're going to be talking about how we can best serve Chinese clients for Western companies, organizations, and agencies. Um, if you are, I see we're still waiting for some people to join, but in the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let me know what your name is, whether you're from an agency. Is there a specific challenge that you are looking to? And that being said, I'll wait a few more minutes. We are waiting for some people to join. But in terms of what we'll be talking about today, we'll be talking about my own experience working the past 15 years in mainland China, working within Chinese tech companies such as Huawei, such as Vivo, and how do we bridge the gap between Western or overseas agencies that are trying to help Chinese companies expand their market position, their brand, their sales in overseas markets, and of course, um, with the actual internal dynamics, the organizations, the decision makers, and what the expectations are in Chinese organizations. There is a very big cultural gap. It's not simply language, it's not simply how we think, it's also in my experience, at least, very much how organizations behave, how organizations think. And because we have very Western organizations or working with Chinese organizations, often not the best fit, at least initially. So this webinar, hopefully with your questions, will allow us to impart some of that information. I'll be sharing my own experiences, and hopefully it will help all of you, whether you're doing business with China, whether you're servicing Chinese clients, or just learning more about what China and Chinese companies are actually like. So, again, my goal for today's webinar is really that we'll be able to have not simply me talking, of course, that's why I'm here, but I would love to get your questions. Uh, Hold on. Yeah, I would love to get your questions. I would love to hear from you, whether you have any comments from what I'm saying, whether you want to share, or you just have an additional question that maybe I haven't covered. Um, all right, so first comment, thanks. Uh, Thanks to Chris Foley for joining. It's great to see you here. I know we talked previously on LinkedIn. So again, we'll be able to have hopefully a nice discussion with some of you. And just really, we're here completely free. There's no risks. We're just going to talk about what it's like. If you have any questions, you can always drop it in the chat. So again, thanks for that. Hi, Chris. So we've got 10 people now, so I think we're going to start. Um, First of all, who am I? I'm Sean. I've worked in China for 15 years. I've been based in Shenzhen for about 10, 11 years. I've been here since 2014. It's when I first moved over from Shanghai to start working with Huawei, which was a little bit like trying to ride the whirlwind. But that is one thing you find out when you're working either inside Chinese tech companies or with Chinese tech companies, say from the agency standpoint. And I've actually been on both sides. I've been mainly in-house, but I have worked with Western agencies, helping them to set up their Shenzhen office and to service clients. So I kind of have seen both sides, but I'm mainly on the client side, which is what we're going to be talking about. And again, if you have any questions, anything that's unclear, feel free to let me know. But again, my focus, whether it be working inside Chinese companies as an employee, uh, working with Chinese companies, helping overseas to help Western agencies and Western companies partner more effectively with Chinese companies, is to really have something more bilingual, bicultural execution. One of the reasons for that, and we'll talk a little bit more about these later, but one of the challenges that Western agencies face is that, especially in companies where they don't speak much English, often the key client servicer is the most junior person who maybe is 1 year out of university, and they speak some English, and then they're the one that services the clients, and you can't really have a higher level of service talking to the directors, executives, the boss of the company if you don't have not only the language but the cultural element as well. So I help to bridge that gap. And then, of course, As you may have seen from my one of my videos on LinkedIn, I do help people to understand the cultural nuances. So, um, any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat. Um, and so, what I will do is, unless there's any questions, I am going to continue on. I'm going to be discussing some of these points. If you have any questions on these points, drop them in the chat. I'll either talk about them afterwards, or I'll talk about them at the moment. Um, Later on, we are going to have a place where I talk about maybe some case studies from when I was with Hub, Vivo, and really kind of some of the things that are uh, agencies can do right, agencies can do wrong. But again, what clients might do right, what clients might do wrong. It's not simply agencies are in the wrong. It's really it's a two-party system. The client has certain needs that they want to do, and the agencies have certain services they want to offer. And we don't always have a very close fit. So let's talk more about that if you have any questions at that point. And also at the very end of the webinar, I will wait for about 10, 15 minutes just to answer any additional questions people have. All right, so moving onwards, let me just check this quick. So moving onwards. Wait, hold on. All right, there we go. So what are our goals for today? When it comes to working with a client, either from China or from any other culture, there are many challenges, and I've seen these from both sides. But what I want to stress here is even though the title of this webinar is What Western Partners Get Wrong, we do want to think of this more of a learning experience. We don't want to say that the only incorrect party in a China client Western agency relationship is the agency, because I mean, in the end, it's the client agency relationship. Maybe the agency will always be blamed, but I think there are opportunities to learn on both sides. And I do believe there were some people that were going to join from the China side. So if there are any Chinese locals or Chinese people working in Chinese companies, I'd love to hear any thoughts you have in terms of what challenges you faced working with you or your colleagues have faced working with Western agencies. Have there been any breakdowns in communication? Just feel free to let me know in the chat. Again, right now we're on LinkedIn, we're on YouTube, we are on X. So any questions, feel free to let me know. And again, if there's any questions that you don't want to address here in the live session, you can always DM me on LinkedIn and we can have a nice chat later. So, from what I've seen, again, there's many different ways that you can say do marketing or PR, but when it comes down to the client agency relationship, the agency's always doing the execution. There's another aspect that many agencies don't see in that in terms of maybe we have, say, a PR campaign to do, and a certain amount of media to reach out to, or it could be a social media campaign. There's everything the agency works on, but then there's maybe, it feels like at least 2 to 3 times as much work on the client side to make sure we get all the resources from the right departments, to make sure that everything is executed from other teams if there is a multi-department effort going on. And so hopefully you'll be able to get more of a look at what it's like from the internal side and having more of an appreciation for what the Chinese client goes through. I think that can definitely allow everybody to have a better experience, or at least have more knowledge going into a Chinese client experience. So again, any questions? Anyone on LinkedIn, YouTube, X, feel free to drop them in the chat. Um, I I always prefer to have more of a discussion if people have questions they'd like to ask. So no worries if you do. So and again, it's I think a really important thing to point out is that this isn't the Western agency way versus the Chinese way, because I've worked with a lot of different agencies, or my departments that I've been in have worked with a lot of agencies during my time in China. And Chinese agencies, big ones, small ones, they get it wrong too. Um, Western agencies, who send teams comprised completely of local Chinese, they also fail. So it's less an issue of Western versus Chinese culture, and it's more an issue of agencies and external providers, no matter what country they come from, not necessarily understanding what, say, a specific Chinese organization's internal dynamics, culture, and the like. So let's talk more about that going forward. And again, if you would like to introduce yourself, say hi, feel free. If you have any questions that you'd like me to answer now or later, feel free to let me know. So, based on my own experience, and uh, this will not necessarily be the same for every single agency or consultant who has worked with Chinese organizations, but based on my own experience, I've seen Western agencies face issues stemming from they haven't been able to build a relationship or even a rapport with people that are in the more senior decision-making level, and that might be anyone who is a director, vice president, higher than that, because really what it comes down to is the decisions are made in a very top-down manner, and if you don't understand what the intent is, then it can be very hard to shape the services you're going to offer, especially if you're working with a very junior level person as your key client-facing representative. Um, because let me give you an example, Clay. So one of the roles I've had over the past is I was previously in Vivo, which is one of the big smartphone companies. BBK has the Oppo, Vivo, OnePlus trifecta, but I was working in Vivo for about a year and a half, and I was leading global media and influencers at the time. So they have complicated internal relationships. But I was a fairly senior level expert, and then we were working with the director of the PR team, who was then working for the head of the global brand department. And so oftentimes what we were doing before we even talked to the agency, it wasn't simply, okay, here's what my job is that my boss tells me. It's something, okay, well, what are my boss's KPIs? What are they looking to accomplish? And then even after that, what is their boss looking to accomplish? And if you're able to understand that, even for the in-house side, it offers a lot more clarity. And so even if you aren't able to develop relationships, it may be very important to understand not what your client-facing partner is telling you, but to understand what their orders are, what they've been told from even higher up. So again, misreading the brief. There can be very big differences when it comes to what people say on paper, especially if they're using industry jargon, and what is actually intended to be accomplished internally. So, for example, the classic one for me is you're told that the company wants to build an American brand or an American market style brand, but then what they actually mean is they want to drive sales very fast. So asking additional questions can help with this. It doesn't always help because some clients, Chinese or otherwise, can be very opaque with how much information they want to let out. But again, that's another thing. So another person, hello to Arif. Thanks for joining the stream. Hope you're able to learn some interesting information. I know we connected previously on LinkedIn, so we can always chat more later. But again, thanks for joining the chat. Um, so again, there's the relationship and the understanding of what's happening higher up that can be a challenge. There's maybe not understanding the brief or having your client-facing partner not communicating clearly to you what actually is expected. There's can be a disconnect between what's given in the pitch, especially if it's a multi-agency pitch. Everybody wants to uh, get the money, get the project, especially if it's a few $1 million. But then maybe it falls through, or maybe there are other difficulties in terms of agency-client collaboration that can then result in things not turning out so well, at least from the client's perspective. And then, of course, fragmented support is one of the biggest issues, and that's, of course, can come from both sides. Uh, my my biggest gripes, although, and this is simply from an in-house perspective, I understand it happens for a variety of agencies, a variety of reasons from the agencies side, is that when we get junior teams, uh, mainly because, from my standpoint, working on the in-house previously, is that it simply creates more work for the internal team to deal with. But of course, at the same side, the clients in Chinese organizations, in large part, not always, but in many cases, have very siloed structures. And um, sorry, lost my train of thought. But yeah, there can be very siloed functions on the client side, which can then, we often, as the Western side, Western facing marketing, branding, PR, we often go into things thinking that we want to have a integrated approach, but that often does not work well for the Chinese clients unless there is someone to really work their butts off and push that through. And in my own work experience, I've sometimes been the person who has needed to push that through, though it doesn't always make people very happy, which we might talk about later. But again, those are some of the challenges I've seen. If you've seen any, um, thanks again for a comment from another LinkedIn user. Yeah, working with Chinese leaders can also be interesting, though I find that if you actually have the access to a Chinese leader, then at least you don't have to deal with necessarily the gatekeepers or with the game of telephone that you might be playing to try and figure out what they're actually asking. But again, this is one of those aspects that comes with Chinese culture. I mean, it's we are not here to say one culture is better than the other, one approach is better, but they're different, and we have to find the best way to connect that gap in order to make sure that we, from the agency side, can get what we want, make money, and make the client happy, and to make sure that the client can get what they want, which often means they're meeting their KPIs, which means they don't get in trouble or they get a pat on the back or a bonus, and then they want to keep working with you. So, hi to Sophia. Thanks very much for joining the chat. I know we talked previously. So for everyone, if you do need to leave early, or if you want to look at this live stream later, I believe it will be recorded on LinkedIn and it will also be on my YouTube channel, which is again, um, well, in case you want to just check there. Um, you can check on my YouTube channel, which is Sean underscore China, just in case you want to be able to reference it later. But the software I use, Restream, it streams it, saves these channels, so you can always come back and look at the chat later. So again, thanks to everybody for their comments. And again, I'd love to hear that if anybody's had a really good experience, a success story, where they really felt they were able to understand what the Chinese client wanted, definitely let me know. I have a few I can share when we get to that section. But uh, again, just to summarize some of the challenges I've seen Western agencies face, feel free to let me know if you see something different, is that we have trouble building relationships, trouble understanding what the key issues are, what they really want to achieve. There's a disconnect between what the client wants to do on the short scope, maybe get some really quick results versus maybe it's much more likely on the Western side that we focus on more integrated, more big, more long approaches. And again, execution is very important for Chinese companies. And of course, fragmented support can be a big issue. It can also erode trust as well, which is something we don't want. We can help it. Any questions before we move on what challenges Western agencies face? So feel free to drop that in now or later once we get to the discussion section. But again, I see we have some more people joining. Thanks to all of you today. We are talking about how Western and overseas organizations and agencies can better understand the needs, the thought processes, the internal working dynamics of Chinese clients in order to make the clients happy, to get more success stories, and to keep working with them. So, um, now let's talk about what are some of the challenges that clients face, the Chinese clients. And this is not exhaustive. It doesn't cover every single Chinese company I work with, but it does cover companies that I've worked with, I have experienced over the past 15 years. So, first of all, Chinese clients have great products, and this is something we often hear talked about overseas. Chinese clients, or I would say Chinese companies, make cheap products, not good quality. But as many of us in China know, Chinese companies now make excellent products, especially in the tech sector. The problem is that everything is focused on the product. Even when they talk about brand, they may actually be talking about the product, and they all often do not have the best relationships with the end user. They often don't really understand what the purpose of PR or social media is. I've had clients where I've had executives internally when I've worked in Chinese organizations say, "Well, we aren't getting any direct sales from social media. Why are we doing this?" So it's a very kind of blinders on type of approach. They can often be overconfident, or they can rather be looking at what has succeeded for industry giants, such as DJI, such as Huawei, and say, "Hey, we want to do that," um, without understanding that, say, for example, DJI certainly has done great marketing, and they still get great products, but they also have more or less worldwide monopoly on the drone industry. Whereas, if you have a client, a Chinese client trying to copy something like that, and every Western competitor or overseas competitor has a larger market share and more trust than they do, then you simply can't do it. But they don't always necessarily make that connection in their mind. So different ways of thinking. Um, Whatever it is. Again, there's no brand. It's often just a commodity product. It's simply here's the specs, here's the price, and if another Chinese company or another company from elsewhere comes along and does it better, does it cheaper, then there's no loyalty. Customers are not sticking around. Um, there's an issue with copycatting. Not all companies, but some. Though again, as we talked about, someone on LinkedIn, when we say copycatting from a Western standpoint versus Chinese companies mean, it's often different. They can often iterate different versions very quickly. They can adapt products and designs to fit the market. But examples I've seen are when maybe they just copy exactly. It does happen. It does happen. China is filled with many different types of company, many different types of philosophy, but there certainly are companies that will just make the same type of products. Or another case I've seen is that they maybe when they're talking about external promotion marketing, they will just copy the style of the marketing materials as say the top competitor, um, which again they don't have their distinct identity. They might simply be reinforcing um, the brand of the competitor. Um, but again, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and if you have any questions on what I talked about or any other questions that you faced working in China, working with Chinese companies, feel free to let me in. I'd love to have you part of the conversation. And again, for those of you who joined, my name's Sean. I've worked in Shenzhen for 10 years. And I've worked in China for 15 years, mainly working with Chinese organizations. And so that is where the root of our discussion today is coming from. So moving on, siloed orgs are a very big challenge because we often have Chinese organizations that started off as OEMs uh, or simply as sales organizations, which means that they're used to having sales or product teams just push forward, execute everything by themselves. And the problem comes when they try and say, okay, well, now we want to try and build customer trust, marketing, branding overseas. They find that, oh, well, maybe we actually have to have everyone together on a project. And um, it works good for some organizations, but it depends. For example, Vivo, Huawei, they often have very clear product launch or campaign processes where maybe people don't want to work together, but everybody has to attend the meetings and they all have their assigned tasks. But I've also seen other Chinese organizations, often smaller ones, where they will where everything breaks down sometimes. It's simply that many people they do not have that experience, uh, either from their own work experience or simply in terms of what the organization is used to. They just simply don't know how to work together well, and sometimes it relates to authority, sometimes it relates to just not knowing how to do it, not having a clear mindset or structure in place. Um, it's very common for higher ups, especially if they don't speak English or other languages they haven't really traveled overseas. They might expect things to work exactly the same as in China, which means the media works differently in China versus overseas. Social media works differently. So again, these expectations can be a problem if there is no education as part of the experience. Uh, Lastly, and this is an interesting point for me, but this is something I've seen time and again, that Chinese companies, Chinese clients execute very fast, but they change very slowly, which has to do with stakeholders that are existing that remain in place. Whereas maybe the CEO wants to, you know, launch a brand quickly, or he wants to execute a certain product launch quicker. Like we had one time where the CEO suddenly told me that, oh, we need to launch our campaign 1 month sooner than we were originally going to, and that was not very fun, but we got it done. The point is that when working with a Chinese client, especially if you have more trust and you are doing a larger project, is that if you are executing fast, but then what you're executing is forcing other internal stakeholders to change, that is a very big stressor in terms of you don't want to be executing the project well, but then someone several levels above your key client contact gets lots of complaints from the departments, and they just decide that you're just too much of a hassle. So it's a difficult balancing act, but it's important to be aware that that type of thing can happen. Again, any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. It's good to have all of you here. And next, we are going to be talking about my experience. And again, I think when you're coming into any engagement with a Chinese client, whether you're pitching, whether you've got the project, you've won the bid, and you are working with them, it's always important to keep in mind how Chinese think, because as I mentioned before, it doesn't matter if they tell you they want to build a brand overseas. If if they actually mean something else, then that's what you're expected to deliver. So um, products are always most important. Um, this has always been the case. It will probably always be the case. Product and sales. And so whenever you're pitching, whenever you're talking to, you need to keep that in mind. And um, I mean, I've had situations where someone asked for my help pitching to a Chinese clients, and I said, "Well, hey, this is a great pitch, but you aren't saying anything about sales." And they said, "But it's of course they're going to help with the customer trust and sales." I said, "That's the thing. You aren't explicitly telling them, one, that your approach can help them get sales, even if it's not very immediately, but also you're not telling them how it's going to help them get sales." So always keep in mind that they're thinking about product and they're thinking about sales. They're thinking about the volume, the ROI. And so a lot of the things we work on, integrated marketing, branding, PR, other areas, creative, can help in this. But if we aren't explicitly spelling it out, there can be that disconnect in terms of the client says, well, you're not doing what I want you to do, even though I never technically told you I want you to do it. Um, Centralized decision making. Um, and this is one reason why it's always a goal to try and work with the boss, or maybe do a few projects and then be able to get introduced to someone, because there can be very different mindsets in terms of how bosses work. There are some that are very China centric. There are some that are very uh, open to Western ideas, and there are some that are saying no, we had to put everything done on the product, and there are some that will go into Facebook and social communities to read every single comment from the users on how everything can be improved. So you very centralized decision making, but again, because China is not just one culture, it's many different cultures, styles across provinces. Everybody can have different educational backgrounds, different life experiences. So there can be differences in how the boss thinks. It's centralized decision making, but you want to be able to find out what the actual thought process is, if you can, about what is driving those decisions. But again, if any questions on that, feel free to let me know. I'd love to hear your comments. I know we've already had some comments from Chris, from Arif, from Sophia. Any other people want to introduce themselves, feel free to let me know. We are right now on LinkedIn, we're on X, and we are on YouTube as well. So happy to have you all here. Let's move on to the next topic if there's no more questions. So again, clients from China are very fast paced. They want rapid execution. They want quick support and quick feedback, which likely means that if you're not on WeChat, you probably should be. And you probably should have a plan for who is going to be the key person who handles those sometimes late night communications. Um, Relationships work very differently. Oftentimes in China, if relationships are held very close to the chest, whereas say if you're doing media outreach, you can search a lot of those things publicly. And in Western markets, you have um, just because you have a relationship with a journalist or with an influencer doesn't mean that they're immediately going to agree to help out with your client. And Chinese clients, Chinese companies don't always understand that. And again, it's all about sales, or at the very least, there's going to be some vice president or some person above him who's in charge of the overseas markets, and he's going to be the person who is in charge of sales, or he's the one who the CEO or the other bosses, the board, are going to be always talking about why haven't you met our sales numbers. So even if your client contact isn't specifically asking you, their boss and their boss's boss is going to be thinking about that, and so you need to be able to frame partly what you deliver, but also what you report on, how you report it in terms of how it's going to help. So again, any questions, feel free to let me know. Love to hear if any of you have gotten any strange requests or even requests you didn't really understand from Chinese clients. Because again, we're trying to bridge the cultural gap here in terms of improving our operations, including our client-based activities, how we work with Chinese clients. So any questions you have, feel free to let me know. All right, yeah. Yeah, and again, there are expectations that I will not even say Western agencies should be adapting to. I mean, why is there no growth this quickly? I mean, that's obviously not what they should be expecting, though, of course, ideally in the pitch or when you're talking to them, you should be helping them to understand that things don't move that quickly. Storytelling is great if you can justify it, if you can show them that it's actually leading to more traffic. Um, I've said before that sometimes the client will say they want a brand, but they actually want something else. And then, of course, it can be difficult to help Chinese teams understand uh, nuances in Western markets. I remember one time when I was on the agency side, we were working with one of the smartphone companies, and there was one team, and I wasn't even involved. It was the creative team that was working with them. And I remember one of the directors on the client side kept saying, like, "Oh, 我的想法." Like, basically, my way of thinking is basically he's Chinese. He's wanting the Western agency to help them go into overseas markets, but he keeps saying that what I think we should do is this, and it's instinctual. It's based on someone's gut feeling, and when we work in business and life, it's not that easy to turn off, and so it takes more effort, more communications. Yeah, that's very true, Sophia. Um, there could definitely be lots of light messaging. No, that's good too. I mean, I mean, generally speaking, I haven't had that many bad experiences on WeChat. It's simply, if you're working with Chinese clients, or even if you're working inside a Chinese organization, there is the expectation you will respond quickly. In fact, being from on the client side before, some of the most aggravating things. There was one time I was working with one company to do a partnership with a sponsorship organization overseas, and they just would not respond to email. Like it would be a week or a week and a half before I would get a response, and it was driving everybody completely insane. Because we had a schedule that we need to meet. We had told the partner the schedule that we needed to meet, and they simply were not responding. But again, that's a little bit on the outside of what can be normal, even if there are cultural misunderstandings in terms of how fast response time should be. Also love to hear how many of you travel to China on a regular basis to meet with clients or to meet with other companies, because one of the issues that we've been talking about is that if you only have a very junior level person as your main client contact, it can be very hard to understand how the organization works and and how you can best meet the client needs. So if you do come to China often, feel free to let me know. I'd love to hear from you. But let's move on. We've gone for about 37 minutes right now. I don't want to keep all of you too long, so let's power on through. So, as we talked about before, there are cultural differences that I think each side should do their best to try and understand better to provide a better working relationship so each side can better achieve their goals. But at the same time, there's also red flags. There's also bad clients. That's true in any country, I think. So just let me just go here. Thanks for Ali for the comment. All right, so I appreciate the comment, Ali. I will probably save that question till the end of the stream, but no worries. I either if I don't get to it, you can also message me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to talk to you there. So there's always a time when you're working with a client where maybe you realize that this is not going to be the best relationship. Maybe they're just trying to use us. Here's a few points I've seen. Free work. I actually had this happen. I think it was either earlier this year or last year. I was talking to a client on the China side, and I went in career presentation. I met with the CEO and several other executives, and I thought it was going pretty well because they actually had the big problem they had was like internal organization. How do you shift from sales to branding? And after the entire presentation, I was speaking completely in Chinese. He said, that's really good. Now, do all this reorganization planning for us, and then we can see if we want to work with you. So, and that was it was a shame because I felt I really could help them. But I said, okay, well, no, it's not really going to work because I've never really seen a good result from when a client asks for free work or a free idea or free pitch deck, and then they just go do it themselves or they partner with someone else. And I think it happens from all cultures, but it definitely happens in China from time to time. I haven't seen it a huge amount. Red flags. Another one I would say is that it, of course, makes sense that if you're just starting out, you've never worked with a client before, you don't have anybody on your team that speaks Chinese. Of course, it makes sense that maybe you just start working with more junior level people that speak English and you don't get to meet the bosses. But if you've maybe succeeded a number of times, or even if you've come to visit their offices and you still don't get to meet with any directors, VPs, then that will be a sign that there's too many gatekeepers, that there's kind of too much internal strife. Because really, when it comes down to it, you said you want to be able to understand what the big boss wants, so that you can know what he really is looking for, despite however it filters down the chain from the top. Uh, if they keep adding more work, despite what you've already agreed to, that's never going to end well, especially in tech. It's just too easy to get burned out if there's just too much work to do. If they just aren't clear on their goals, they keep changing their goals. I think that's another reason. I mean, obviously, each agency, each professional has to decide for themselves what they think is the red line. But I think it's important to kind of have an internal discussion and understanding before you start working with a Chinese client, or at least you don't have to be too direct with the client, but maybe understand from your side, okay, well, how much is too much? Because one of the things I remember from when I worked with Huawei, and there's many good things about Huawei. There's many things I admire from Huawei, but some of the teams, not all of the teams in Huawei, you always heard that the agencies, the big agencies that came and worked with Huawei, they always sent their B teams because previously the A teams would get burned out and they would quit the agency. So um, it's always important to try and figure out the specific team you're working for, what their dynamics are. Because yes, they will have pressure from the top. Yes, they will maybe be forced to do things they would rather not. But at the same time, If you can know who leads the team, if you can have some sit-down discussions with them online or offline, that can give you a better idea. Is this the right team culture within whatever the company culture is that can be a good client to work with? Um, One thing I've seen sometimes, both the client side and the agency side, is if your efforts are undermined, if they keep doing things behind your back, if they aren't communicating, um, that's not going to lead to a good relationship. And of course, if they just say, "Oh, just get us, get help us go viral," or get us this celebrity deal overseas. I mean, we need to have the expectations be somewhat realistic. Again, any questions? Feel free to. I'm really glad to hear from so many of you so far. We'll have more time for questions during the case study in the end as well. But again, if you have any questions on working with Chinese companies, I have 15 years working with both Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Hong Kong, a number of cities. So I'd love to be able to answer any questions that you have. So, moving on from red flags, let's talk about case studies. So here I would say is the best time for any of you to ask any questions you have. If you've had any experiences that were good, bad, working with Chinese clients, I would say um, feel free to let me know. I'll start off talking about a few cases that I think might be illuminating to you. So let's see. I think we talked before about what it's like to have uh, junior level versus senior level support. So when I was with Huawei, I was a senior expert. That was back in, it must have been after I joined the smartphone product line. And it was about 2016, 2017. And we were working with one of the really big marketing PR agencies. I'm not going to say who, I don't think that's important. But I was in charge of doing all the influencers for our department for one of the big product launch events. And what happened is that we'd gone through a few different client-facing people, but luckily they had a senior director level person, and so we kind of insisted on, okay, well, for everything that we're going to be doing, we had a small team, I think, from the agency, and so what ended up happening was, we had people that had to help us to contact the influencers to arrange their schedules, and then I was the main person on site that was going to be making sure every detail was aligned with all the other departments of the product launch site, which I believe this time must have been in Germany. Yeah, it must have been in Germany because I think we had two product launches in Germany and one in Spain, but I think this one must have been in Germany. Um, but either way, a lot of work to do. I had to coordinate all the influencers on site, not just that, but we had to make sure everything is right place. We have to coordinate the delivery of all the devices, everything like that. And so what we actually did, we insisted on having a director level person who was leading the small agency team to kind of be my key contact person on site because I tried a few different people before, I believe, but it really made such a big difference. I mean, you can have the more junior level people handle the stuff behind the scenes, but I, especially when it comes to the incredible hectic nature of not just a product launch offline, on-site, but say how it can be for a big, very complicated tech company like Huawei or another one, is that that person who had that more experience, they were able to provide a lot more expertise, guidance, and just better execution on site. And there's a few other examples I can list where I simply just had a much better experience, or sometimes where I even insisted that I needed some. But again, not every person is going to be the same as me because I was a foreigner, more experience working inside a Chinese client. You're not necessarily going to find the same attitude or the same forethought from, especially more junior level people. But that's something I found. Um, it's another example. So another example I believe we can give is that. Let me think. What's so when it comes to another time when I was working with someone in the solar field, a company in the solar field, on the client side, one of the things we had one of the big agencies, and they had they sent a number of junior level people because they didn't really have any senior people with experience in the industry. And I remember I was leading the PR team at the time, and what ended up happening was is we to media relations, and we had at least 3 times we had, um, associates who was in charge of the work just sending emails to the wrong journalist 3 different times. Like, it's not simply it happened 3 times in 1 page. It happened once, you tell them, "What are you doing? Don't let the person do this again." Then it happened again, same person, and if you have worked with the client side, it might be hard to understand, but there's so much aggravation that happens, not simply because you realize that they're making your own company look bad because they are representing your company, but it also comes down to that you have to explain this to your higher ups. Uh, no one wants to be in the position where, you know, they have to explain why they let the agency partner do something like that. So I think from my standpoint, if I have to choose, I always want someone more senior. If I have control over the budget from the internal standpoint, I'm definitely going to be willing to pay a little more to get more senior support. It doesn't happen that way, but I think all agents should be aware of having people that are too junior, whether not having enough experience working with Chinese companies. Um, there can be unintended consequences that can harm the relationship, whether with your key client contact, your PIC, or with just the company in general. Um, one thing that I think worked really well is when I was working in another smartphone company. We had this big brand campaign we were doing, and we were having trouble with one of the agencies because they kept just sending, ironically, a Chinese team, a very junior Chinese team. And for reasons I will not go into, we were basically stuck with them. We just didn't have any choices simply because the finance department's restrictions, will say. But what happened was, is that they just kept making mistake after mistake to the point where I had to call one of the people at the overseas office and say, "Give me a different team." And so I got some of the overseas team in there. They were a lot more senior, kind of director level, and they basically then came into the office and they worked with me and one of my key team members, and we basically took the project plan and we just reshipped it about 5 different times, and to the point where then my boss's boss was very happy with it. And so, um, it can be tricky, I understand, because if you're wanting to work with a Chinese organization and you don't have people that understand the culture and language, you often don't have a choice working with junior people, or maybe sometimes you have to send your junior people over. But I think it's important to understand that, um, having the right level of skill can provide a very large amount of difference, especially when it comes to getting things done in the way the client needs to get done. It's not simply wants to get done because the strict level of KPIs you have in Chinese companies, there's so much pressure to get things done the right way that um, if a project doesn't get done the way it's supposed to get done, the way, say, the person you're talking to's boss's boss wants it to get done, then it's going to have some nasty consequences, potentially for whoever you're working with. So, um, something to be aware of. Um, any questions? I'll stop for a minute or two. If there's any questions that anybody has based on what we've discussed so far, feel free to let me know. I'd love to hear from you. So I'm just going to take a break for a second. Definitely let me know if you have any questions. So I'll just pause for a little bit longer in case anybody wants to leave some questions. Oh, apparently the sound is bad. Sorry to hear that. All right. Well, I appreciate the comment, Ulrika. I'm sorry for that. Um, I Let me see if I can hear it myself. So again, I it is a little echoey, so I will try and what I will see if I can do is I will see if I can create. I'll see if I can edit afterwards. It's echoey and see if I can get a better version. If that's the case, I will make a post on my LinkedIn, um, simply where I uh, maybe post a new version that you can get access to. But again, apologies if the sound's not the best. I will try and speak a little slower, but again, I appreciate the feedback. And what I will do is I will see if there's a way I can adjust my microphone from future streams because I will be trying to do something like this every week. But again, I appreciate the comments and feedback. All right, so I will move on. If there's any questions in terms of the uh, case studies or any questions in terms of your own client experiences, definitely let me know. So, from someone who has worked um, in China, inside Chinese companies for almost 15 years, here are some of the key things I think about in terms of if you're interested in working with Chinese organizations, building better relationships, and having more long-term access to specific clients. I would suggest that first of all, focus on starting small. Understand what the person, the department you're working with, what their key KPI is, what determines whether their boss thinks they're doing a good job. You can't necessarily ask this very easily or very directly, but I think it's important. Make sure you succeed on something quickly. Make sure when you have regular reports or regular meetings, make sure you're showing them um, how your progress is built is either succeeding or building towards what they think of as success. Um, Execution is the key. It doesn't matter how great your overseas team is if the team they actually get is a very small, centric team when you were previously telling them how great your North America or Europe is. Um, in the end, execution determines whether a Chinese client thinks you're succeeding or not. Um, if they have unrealistic expectations, make sure you communicate that transparently, clearly, politely, maybe not as directly as you could. There's certainly an art to speak in a non-direct manner to Chinese clients in a polite way, but that also maybe lets them know what they need to know. Gentle education is important, and education doesn't all have to happen immediately. Um, if we're talking about helping a Chinese organization understand what is a brand and how you do branding well, that doesn't necessarily have to happen all within one project. Though, of course, sometimes you never know if you'll get more than one. But you don't want to give your client face, you don't want to get the team that you're servicing too much pressure. You don't want to push them to do too much to the point where they're damaging their relationships with other departments of the company. Um, Again, I suggest planning for single team or single department execution. I have another good example I can give on this, and this is from the same company I worked with where we had the junior team, but I insisted on the senior team in order to make my boss happy. Um, what happened with this is that was when we were doing again PR, though PR when I've done it, it's often it's media influencers, product launches, brand campaigns, so it's media relations. But we were doing um, PR, which was again media and influencers, and this agency kept updating their project plan that we were working on, and they kept trying to put a social sub project within the overall PR, media, and influencers project, and it was one of those things where if we're showing this to internal stakeholders, if we're showing this to other departments, and then we're saying, oh well, they also suggest doing social. It not only says, well, one, do you not know what your agency's doing? Does the agency not know that there is another department that does social? And that's a very easy type of friction that can come about because, as I mentioned, a lot of this execution, even if the goal is, and I've always tried to do this when possible. Uh, I've always tried to do this when possible when I've been inside China, the Chinese client organization. But it doesn't necessarily matter because it really depends on the other departments. I remember another good case study because when you're doing PR, for example, or influencer relations, you have to have review devices, and that means that you have to then get review devices from the product team, or sometimes it's the GTM team. It depends. It varies based on company to company. Um, and in this specific case, it seemed somewhat ludicrous. I basically remember going to look at some of the devices we got. We had 70 to 80 devices we had to get for various media influencers. And we looked at some of them, and the screens were scratched, or the boxes were dusty, or some of the boxes were broken. And this is kind of relates to the silo natures that one would think, oh, well, of course the product team should know that we have to have nice looking devices for the media. But we actually got lots of pushback. We got lots of internal complaints to our boss's boss from the product team about what does the PR team think they're doing? We don't have to give you nice ones. You can just take off the screen cover if they want to review it. Just complete misunderstandings that you would think might um, common logic, common knowledge. And so we actually had to get into a bit of an internal fight, which didn't give us the best relationship with that team simply because we had to cross departmental boundaries. You can't always get around that. You sometimes have to do it no matter what, but also be aware that it's always easier, especially if you're starting off with a new client who you don't quite know how they work, you don't quite know how they operate. It's always best to go for smaller scale, more single department, single team executions just to avoid any additional issues that could damage your own reputation uh, in the mind of the client or cause the team you're working with additional grief because you want things as smooth as possible, execution first, so that you can work with them again. As I mentioned earlier, doesn't matter what you're doing, find a way to mention sales or to talk about how your work somehow helps sales. And then, of course, it's always best if you try and find a way to understand how the organization works that you're working with. And it's tough because even when I've been in an internal role, even when I've, say, been hired by a company, I'm working with them and I'm working with agencies while inside the company, it can sometimes still take a month or two at least before I really start to understand how everything is working about how how one department is very toxic or how the overseas department uh, does lots of things to prevent the I'm sorry the China market does lots of things to prevent the overseas teams from getting the documents they need, just corporate politics type of stuff. And if you can better understand that, it's easier to see if there's more effective ways to service the client, or if you've been pitching the same service that you realize, oh, maybe they don't need that. Maybe this is just not something we should be pushing right now. So understand how the client works, understand how the client thinks, understand how the client operates. Ideally, um, that's through client visits because senior people, especially really senior people that don't speak English, are often not going to be getting all the calls online. But segue into that, just in terms of how I personally, I work with Chinese companies going overseas, but I also work with Western companies wanting to come to China or work with Chinese organizations. So part of what I'm able to do here is simply by being sure you can be at the office. You can see them much more clearly when they're talking to you. You can better understand the nuances of their expression and what they actually might want, what they actually might need. It's much easier to meet uh, mid-level, higher level decision makers if you're not just coming to their office, but you're sitting down for them, you're inviting them for coffee. And of course, you either you or someone you have with you can speak Chinese, communicate with them in Chinese culture. Um, we can help figure out if there's any things that aren't apparent to a Western agency that, say, someone on the ground with experience here might be able to understand, solve problems that you might not be able to do online. And then, of course, making sure that we can execute more smoothly, making sure that there are less misunderstandings to prevent things from moving forward. Now, so that is about all we have for today. It's been about an hour, so I appreciate all of you who have been listening, who have tuned in from LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. I really enjoyed sharing with you my experience working with Chinese companies. If the sound has not been as good as it could have been, I apologize. I thought I had adjusted my mic, and it sounded okay when I did a test recording. But again, if for some reason you're not having a good connection or simply there's an issue, uh, I will see if I can do a sound edited recording if the sound is bad. So I will hold on for a few more minutes. Do you have any questions based on what we've talked about? I do know there is a question from Ali. I'll see if I can get back to that. But first, I want to allow maybe 5 more minutes to see if anybody has any additional questions in terms of working with Chinese clients or any of the points we discussed. So I'll stay on a little bit longer. Um, so let me look at Ali's question since we don't have any questions yet. But again, if you have questions about my own experience, about working with Chinese companies, coming to China, expanding to China, feel free to drop them in the chat. Um, so let's see. Ali says he's moving to China for his MBA and he wants to work with local companies building brands in the West as well. Oh, I mean, it's tough because I mean, if you're in China, it's certainly easier to try and get a job within a Chinese organization. Um, I would say it's better if you can speak some Chinese, because if you can't speak any Chinese, it might limit how much cross-departmental work or collaboration you can do. Um, I think it's also important to understand, what your skill set is. Is this something that Chinese companies are looking for? And when you kind of work for a Chinese company, you also have to realize that you have to execute fast, but maybe not do anything. Maybe it's forcing people to change too much. It can be a double-edged sword. They want to move fast. They don't want to change. If they feel like you're trying to change them, then that might draw some complaints. You do not want to be the foreigner inside a Chinese organization that everybody is complaining about because you're doing things differently. So that's something to be aware of. So I do think that there's plenty of Chinese companies wanting to move overseas, and obviously there's opportunities for many agencies to help them do so. But there's also opportunities for foreigners to come to China and work with Chinese organizations. But there will be culture shock, even if you speak Chinese. Um, Let me check the other channels. If you have any questions, definitely drop them in the chat. If there's anything you'd like to discuss with me one-on-one, you're more than welcome to send me a DM on not WeChat on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to talk with you further. Um, so I hope that answered your question, Ali. Okay, I see we have another question from Sophia. So, how to respond to such unrealistic expectations? Why no growth in 2 weeks? Um, well, I think the best thing possible is to uh, lay out how fast things will happen before you start doing a project. Because if you haven't helped the client understand, or they haven't told their boss what the actual timeline might look like, then it seems more like a face-saving effort if you then say afterwards, oh, it doesn't move that fast. So you should definitely make sure you're clearly setting their expectations before you begin a project, especially because, as I've said before, you don't necessarily know what their boss's boss expects, or even if they're willing to give any pushback to their higher ups, which often doesn't happen in a more hierarchical organization. So again, Another question from Sophia. Uh, could you give an example of when you understood the perspective of the boss's boss and how it was different from the perspective of the person at the lower level? Let's see, what's a good example we could talk about? Oh, okay. This isn't directly relating to marketing, but I can give you an example. There was one company I was working for um, where we were on the overseas team and we were working with the Chinese team, we were working with the corporate team. And there was a lot of kind of corporate politics going on, and there was a lot of things we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to have a more Western-facing approach. We wanted to be able to work more with overseas organizations, but the boss's boss didn't support it. And what actually happened, what we actually found out later, and we actually knew while we were doing it, to be honest, is that he was new. He was only in his position for a year. And so he was very hesitant about making any big changes. And so that was why we wanted to do a lot of new stuff, a lot of good stuff for the company, but it would have given him a lot of flack from other departments. And so we kind of understood that about halfway through. And I can certainly understand that. Uh, as I've said, I think it applies to lots of companies, but especially Chinese companies that maybe have only done the China market and they're starting to move overseas. Um, there's a few issues that come up with that. First of all, one, that means the people who have the most power and are trusted the most are on the China team that have the China perspective. And so that usually when the overseas team comes in, unless they have the China team head be in charge of that department, is you often have, the new team making waves, and they often want to be careful to not to do anything that gets them in trouble or annoys the other team, even if the old team, let's say in this case the China team, is throwing their weight around, or it could be the sales team, to be honest, but they're throwing the weight around, even if they're bullying them a little bit, which does happen. I've seen it happen a few times. They're still going to be very cautious in terms of how they push forward their projects. They don't want to. There's the saying in Chinese, the nail that stands out gets hammered down. So I definitely could understand where he was coming from in terms of not wanting to help us out a little more, because he had to balance a lot of things. He had his own goals as part of the higher level department. He had to make sure he was making his own bosses happy, and he didn't want another department head person to complain to their boss, which they would complain to his boss. So it's certainly understandable. It's definitely frustrating when it comes to, if we're working in marketing or PR or whatnot, and we have this goal we want to set, and we're really passionate about helping the company, but there's these barriers, whether they're cultural barriers, organizational barriers, that prevent us from achieving those. But being cognizant, being understanding of when those barriers exist, we can then see if we can find a new path. We can focus on doing something smaller, focus on a more execution related goal, which will make our client facing or our client team happier, because their bosses will be happier. It will allow us to maybe work with them more. Maybe other departments will hear that, this agency did a good job, and then you might have more opportunities. So it's not always about the straight, fast, and narrow approach. Sometimes you have to step carefully to avoid organizational politics or just differences in organizational structure. I hope that answered your question, Sophia. And so I see we still have about 20 people in the stream. It's great that we have this many people, especially since this is my first LinkedIn Live in a while. If you have any questions, it doesn't have to be just about working with Chinese clients, but if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'd be very happy to hear from you. And again, if you have any other questions, you can always DM me on LinkedIn later. That's always fine as well, too. I'm generally very fine accepting DMs, talking with people. I love sharing and exchanging views on different countries. Yeah, no problem, Sophia. Glad that was good for you. So again, I'll stay on a little bit longer, but If you are tuning in from a stream that is, what is this? Hold on. If you are coming in from a non-LinkedIn platform and you want to follow me on LinkedIn, you can, not that one. Yeah, if you want to search me on LinkedIn to connect there, you can look for me at China Going Global. And of course, you can always follow me on YouTube as well, or Twitter, for conversations about China, Sean UM_China. Um, if you have any additional questions, again, my name is Sean. I've been working here in Shenzhen for 10 years, working within Chinese tech companies. I now have my own company to which I work with Chinese companies going overseas. And I also work with Western organizations that want to enter China and also to better work and collaborate with Chinese organizations. Um, so appreciate everybody watching. If there's no more questions, I think I will probably end the stream. But again, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn if you haven't already. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a direct DM. And if you enjoyed what you heard today, I hope you will join us next Wednesday for another yet to be decided live stream on doing business in China, bridging the divide between China and other countries. So thank you again for joining us. My name is Sean, and I will hope to see you next time. Bye-bye. Yes, I will definitely, for the LinkedIn users who just commented, I will definitely make a post on my LinkedIn if I have a better version, or and I'm not sure if it's probably my mic. It could be someone's connection. I'm not sure. It could just be the software. I will definitely make a post if there is a link with a better audio quality. So again, thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.